When the shell exploded, it's smashed my right leg below the knee, and my left leg I lost the front of my foot. And before getting out of the tank, I was burnt on the hand and my forehead, but managed to get out of the tank. I have to say that if I'd been in that tank another minute probably, I wouldn't have ever got out. Well, at one stage, I must admit that I did think about, packing it all in. And I had a revolver, but it fortunately was on my right side, and that hand was, as I say, burnt, and I found it impossible to do anything about it. And that thought soon left me. But it did occur to me at one stage that perhaps, sort of in view of the injuries, it would be worth packing it in. But fortunately, I didn't. My name is Roy Hayward. I'm a double amputee from wounds received on the 25th of June after D-Day.
This interview was made possible through Blesma. As you have seen by the intro of this video, we are beyond privileged to share a harrowing testimony from Mr. Roy Hayward, who became a double amputee at the age of 19. I am so honored to have been in his presence and to have documented his story for future generations. Mr. Hayward does not often openly talk about his experiences. As you can imagine, they are quite traumatic. But he agreed to this interview if it would help Blesma. Blesma, the Limbless Veterans, is an armed forces charity dedicated to assisting serving and ex-service men and women who have suffered life-changing limb loss or the loss of a use of a limb, an eye, or sight. Blesma supports these men and women in their communities throughout the United Kingdom. Blesma's mission is to help returning veterans live rewarding, independent, and fulfilling lives. Ever since the First World War, Blesma has worked tirelessly to make sure that veterans are not forgotten, left behind, or have to fend for themselves. As you will hear in Mr. Hayward's incredible testimony, Blesma was there for him since day one. I also want to thank the Stanley W. Escrum for the financial support to make this interview happen.
I joined 1943, of course, when I was 18, and at the middle of 1944 finished training, and round about the June of that year I was sent to a regiment which turned out to be the Sherwood Rangers, who had had a very distinguished career in the desert, and I think they had done so well that they were brought back to England and told that they would be trained to go over on D-Day. So they were trained on these tanks, which were supposed to they had a big arrangement round the tank, which was supposed to allow them to rather float to the beach. But it wasn't very successful in the end. But this is what they were being trained in, and as I say, I joined them, and of course by then their tanks were all crewed, so I was made a reserve tank crew. And eventually, when they went over on the initial onslaught, I followed on that evening in an ammunition lorry as a reserve tank member. And of course, with they lost quite a few men, the regiment lost quite a few men, and I was called up to go in to join a tank crew. One morning we were travelling down a lane, and an infantry sergeant had said that they were having trouble just down the lane where there was obviously a tank or something that was impeding their progress. Would we go and see what we could do about it? So we started down this lane, and suddenly there was a big thud on the front of the tank, and nothing, it didn't come through, But then there was another one. We tried to avoid it, but another one came through and actually penetrated the tank. The tank was a Sharma, which they could produce many of, but unfortunately they were known as Tommy burners, and they always seemed to catch light when the shells exploded in the tank. So it was absolutely essential that we all got out of the tank. And I think the other members of the crew got out, and I realised that I'd got to get out too, and didn't know what had happened to me at that stage, but I managed to stand and get out of the tank cockpit and drop down into the lane outside the tank. By then I'd been burnt on my forehead and my hand, my right hand, and when I got down in the lane, I crawled as far away from the tank as I possibly could, and then I turned on my back and I could see just what damage had been done to me, which was below the knee of my right leg was absolutely smashed and quite useless, and the front of my left foot had been blown off, but had left me just sufficient heel to be able to stand and get out of the tank. And so that was one of the best bits of luck in my life, I think, that bit of heel was left. Anyway, I lay in the lane for some time, knowing what had happened to me. I wasn't in pain, really. I was getting more pain from the burns than I was from my legs, presumably because of the explosion had probably, sort of numbed everything. In the tank, I was doing the job of radio operator, and so it didn't involve me too much, but I was also, if I'd had the chance, I was also supposed to be loading the gun for the gunner who would be shooting the gun, but I would have been helping with the loading of the gun. But as I say, it was a question of getting out. And eventually, from the side of the lane, I heard a voice come and it said, "Are you alive?" And I hastily confirmed that I was, and 2 stretcher bearers came out and with a stretcher, and I was put on the stretcher, and then they took me to where there was a jeep, and on this jeep there was a metal framework which went up quite high, and they put me up on this metal framework, and I finished up about 10 feet up in the air, and we then drove round to the hospital tent, field hospital, and it was an enormous great tent, and we parked outside there and they were just going to get me off, and I've never forgotten that somebody shouted out, "Shelling," and everybody went flat on the ground, and I looked down and there was everybody flat on the ground, and I was 10 feet up in the air. But fortunately they decided that the shelling had stopped, so they then took me into the tent, and I really know very little about what happened then, but eventually I found that I was on a stretcher hooked onto the wall of a tank landing craft and I was on my way back to Portsmouth, where I went straight away into hospital. In hospital, I was only in there a day or two, but one nurse came one morning and said, "We want to do new dressings." So they took my dressings off. For the first time, they took my dressings off the wounds, and to my horror and her delight, the wounds were absolutely covered in maggots. And she was delighted because she said they've cleaned the wounds completely, and she said they really are in a good state. And it was all due to these maggots, which she picked off one by one and put into a jar. And I've always been thankful for those maggots, actually. But after a few days, there was some bombing going on. The doodle bugs, as they called them, were then coming over, and they decided that they would move me with a number of other people up north. So once again I was on a stretcher, hooked onto a wall, but this time of a carriage that had been converted to take stretchers. And I was on there. When we got to London, there was some bombing going on, and we waited for a long time. So by the time I got to Preston Royal Infirmary, which was where I was headed, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. And they took me in and put me into a bed. I went to sleep, and when I woke in the morning, I found that I was in a ward that had 30 or 40 other wounded people from the war. And there I settled in for quite a few weeks, about 12 weeks in all, but the nurses were, it was an absolutely marvellous hospital, and the nurses were superb, and it was very nice. I suppose I was young and I was quite badly wounded, and the other chaps were very good to me. Took me, whenever they went out on an outing, they took me with them in a wheelchair and looked after me. So I had I didn't have a lot of difficulty, and I wasn't in a lot of pain, so fortunately it wasn't a bad period of this 12 weeks while I was healing. After the 12 weeks, they decided that my wounds had healed enough to go into a hospital where I would be measured for artificial limbs. I then went to Leeds, where there was one of these hospitals, and they measured me and took casts of my stumps. And one of the most amusing episodes was when I was taken to a shoe shop, and they said to me, "How big a feet do you want?" So I was able to choose what size feet I wanted, but of course all I did was choose a pair of shoes that appealed to me, and whatever size they were, that was going to be the size of my feet from then onwards. So they then sent the measurements and cast to Roehampton Hospital, which was nearer to my home, and I was then taken home. Within a day or two of arriving home, Blesma got in touch with me and said, "If there's anything you want, get in touch with us." And from that day onwards, they have always been available to me. But I managed after a bit to cycle, which was a great help. And then I decided that I now got to go back and start earning a living. There was no question of convalescence or anything like that. You were handed your legs and said, "There you are, get on with it," and you did. So I did as much walking as possible, and then decided I was ready, and I went back to my old job in Covent Garden, London, and I used to travel by bike to the local station and then by train to Waterloo, and I would walk across Waterloo Bridge to Covent Garden, and that I think was very good for me because it really got me walking a lot, and of course it was as good as any therapy that I could have had. So I had a number of years there, and I met my wife. She was working in the same branch, and we got married in 1948. I have a very, very satisfactory life, and I've had very little to complain about. I think that on the whole, the thing I missed most was my sport. I missed that very badly at first, but I was able to swim, and on our holidays down on the coast, I can always remember that I used to go swimming after everybody else had gone back to have their evening meal. I used to go down to the beach with my wife, and I'd take my legs off and I would crawl into the sea. And I can remember one evening when I was doing this, I was up to about my chest, kneeling there, and a young man came rushing past me, and as he looked at me, he said, "Are you standing in a hole?" Because, of course, I was kneeling. The water was up to my chest, but his idea was that somehow I'd found a hole in the beach and I was standing in that. But anyway, that was a great help that I could swim, but eventually the crawling in over sand became a bit more than I was prepared to do, and when we went on holidays abroad I was able to swim in the swimming pools, but I gave up sea swimming at that time because it was rather difficult to get the sand all off my knees when I'd crawl back in. But other than that, I think, sort of my life went on fairly normally, and as I say, I really have no complaints. The only thing I would say is that I think what has buoyed me all the time has been the fact that I got back, and so many of my friends and regiment never returned from the war at all. And I'm still looked after by Blesma, and although we've had to close our branch because of lack of numbers, I now go to the hub, which has been formed recently, and means that I go and meet other former soldiers and services people, and I'm able to go and have a coffee and chat to them, and it's a very social occasion, and that is a great asset as well. So really I'm not, I wouldn't complain about my life because I'm so conscious of the fact that I'm still alive rather than dying out in Europe or wherever you were in service.
Thank you so much. You've given an absolutely spectacular, wonderful overview. It's a lot to talk about. I have a lot of questions. Please tell me about the first time you saw your family after your injuries.
This was one of the worst aspects, one of the worst things that had ever happened to me, because my mother and father came to visit me in the hospital in Southsea before I was taken up to the north, and they had not been told what was wrong with me, and so I had to tell them, that how extensive my injuries were, and that was a very sad moment for me. That affected me more than anything else I think that ever happened. It was the fact that I had to tell them about it. But they visited me up north when I moved up north, and sort of we adapted as well as we could. And as I say, when I came back to live there, I had no legs, but they looked after me so well all the time. And eventually, I think it was my mother who said, I think you're going to have to start giving me housekeeping. So I decided I'd got to go back to work and earn some money, little as it was. But that was one aspect of that was a very sad time for me.
I can imagine. You mentioned how close you were as a family.
Yes.
And for them to see their little boy,
Yep.
In that situation, could you please give us a little more detail? When they came up to the hospital, your mom and your dad, to visit you, and you told them about your injuries, what was their initial reaction? How did they take it?
I think they were horrified, but from then on they encouraged me to think that in due course I would have limbs and be walking again, and sort of that was the attitude that I had to accept, and I think they were helpful in that manner. And as I say, when I got back without legs, they looked after me extremely well.
Could you please tell us about the early prosthetics that you had right after the war, really during the war, and what that was like, how cumbersome they were?
Yes, it was a metal leg which came up to my knee, and then there were straps on those legs, and I had a harness over my shoulder and a belt, a canvas harness and a belt, and then straps going down from that to be attached to the straps that were coming up from my legs, and I also had leather corsets on all my thighs, strapped up, you know, sort of very, very tightly. So they were enormous, really, these legs. And now, of course, all I've got is a leg and a strap above my knee, which has made a tremendous difference. Although, as I say, I managed perfectly well with the others, but of course it's so much better to just have the strap rather than all this contraption that was quite uncomfortable, I suppose, but something, you know, that you accepted. The difficulty with this infantry sergeant was that we took him onto the tank, and he was coming as a passenger to tell us where we were to go. And when the tank caught light, everybody left. He didn't know what was happening at all. Never having been in a tank before in his life, he didn't know what to do. And it delayed me getting out because I had to push him out before I could get out. And I think that delayed me a little. And I mean, I have to say that if I'd been in that tank another minute, probably, I wouldn't have ever got out. So, you know, but I managed to push him out, and he went out, and he was quite all right, not wounded at all. And you know, sort of, as I say, it was just a question of encouraging him to get out quickly so that I could get out as well. And but other than that, you know, sort of, other than being burnt, there was one interesting thing when I was at the Preston Hospital. There was a very jovial ward porter who looked after us very, very well. And they put me out in the afternoons. They put me out on a stretcher, wheeled me out into the open air so that the air could get at my burns. They were worried about the burns, and that they thought the fresh air would do them good. And I remember I was out there once, and I had a sheet which I had just over me, and I dropped off to sleep. And when I woke up, I found that the sheet was up over my face, and I was moving. And when I pulled the sheet down, there facing me was this porter wheeling me, and there in front of me was the mortuary. And he said, "Oh, I thought you died." All joking, but I was a bit surprised that, you know, I was heading for the mortuary.
What made them think that you...
No, he didn't really think that, no. It was just his way of a joke, really. I don't think he'd have ever put me in the morgue. There were humorous things, you know, sort of that you noticed. I mean, I must admit that although my leg dropped off on the bowling green, that wasn't as bad as the fact that I was coming home from work one day, and on the Waterloo station concourse, a foot dropped off there, and there was an elderly lady behind me, and there she was, looking horrified. There was a shoe and a sock lying on the floor in front of her. I had to get a taxi home that night because I managed to get to a waiting room, and finally got a taxi home without my foot, or carrying my foot, I would say. Yes.
So, could you tell us, sir, when you were in the tank, before you were wounded, like that, but during that episode, could you tell where the enemy fire was coming from and what it was?
No, you couldn't see anything at all. I suspect that it was a Tiger tank, which there were quite a lot about, and I suspect that it was probably an 88mm shell that hit us once and bounced off, but then, you know, sort of the next one, as I say, came through, and I suspect that's what it was. I have to say that I think it would be true to say that the German tanks were possibly superior to the tanks that we were in. But, you know, sort of it was a question of, with the Sherman tanks, they were so replaceable. There were so many of them that, you know, it wasn't, they were expendable. But then you've got to think about the crews, of course. I was very lucky too. We had we lost one of the colonel of the regiment, who only joined them when they came back to England. He was wounded on the beach, so he went. He was taken back to the mainland, and another colonel took over, and he was in a barn talking to his senior officers, and a shell landed on the barn and killed him. So we lost 2 colonels within about a week. And then another colonel came on who served in the desert and had received a lot of medals. He was very, very brave in the desert, and he was made colonel of the regiment and proved he went right through the war and was, you know, absolutely superb. And the other person I would mention is we had a chaplain to the regiment called Skinner, and he would never let any tank crew go into a tank that had burnt out. He went and cleared the tank out himself every time there was a burnt tank. He would go into that tank, and any mementos or anything that could be sent to relations, he would see that they went to the relations, and he kept a note of where everybody was buried. I saw him once, and he was just carrying a sort of a sack, and there was part of a body in it. And, you know, he would go into these tanks where there were charred remnants of the people that had been in the tank, and he would clear everything out if he possibly could. I had a tremendous, you know, thoughts about him. I thought he was wonderful, and he came through it, and so did the colonel. So I'm glad to say that they both, you know, despite all that they were doing, they actually got right through the war, and I was very pleased about that.
Could you please tell me, sir, you were talking about the fire earlier. The Shermans were known as the lighters.
Yes,
lighters.
yes.
So the second shell, what would you say was the time gap between the first and the second, sir?
I would say possibly 30 seconds or no more, about 30 seconds, I would think. I mean, they'd got the range, and they knew they'd hit us. They didn't need to do much else other than fire again. And as I say, that one came through.
Did you guys, in that 30-second period, is that what you were expecting again?
We were trying to reverse and get out of the way, yes.
And so the second shell comes, and the thing that you mentioned that you remember mostly, it was the fire.
Yes.
And so you're burnt in the forehead and the hand.
Yep.
And it was the right hand?
Right hand, yes.
And you're waiting for the army sergeant to get out. You push him out, and then you get onto in the lane.
Yes.
You mentioned that there was this one time, that was correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're laying there, face up in the lane, that's the first time you saw your injuries.
That's right, yes.
Did you have a suspicion before just by the feeling, what it could have been?
No, I was completely numb. I had no feeling there at all. And as I say, the fortunate thing was that although I had these wounds, they were neither of them bleeding. So I wasn't losing a lot of blood, which was, you know, probably a very good thing. And it's just a question of waiting until somebody arrived, which unfortunately, you know, I mean, it could have been the Germans that advanced, and I was then going to be a prisoner of war. But you know, as it happened, they didn't, and eventually, as I say, these stretcher bearers arrived. Now, whether they'd been sent because of, you know, the people knew that the tank had been hit, I don't know, but anyway, they were, you know, sort of arrived at the right time and looked after me.
When you saw your injuries for the first time, as someone who has not experienced that, of course, I mean, how would you? What went on in your head, sir?
Well, at one stage, I must admit that I did think about, you know, packing it all in, and I had a revolver, but it fortunately was on my right side, and that hand was, as I say, burnt, and I found it impossible to do anything about it, and that thought soon left me. But it did occur to me at one stage that perhaps, you know, sort of in view of the injuries, it would be worth packing it in. But fortunately, I didn't.
I'm sorry that you were ever in that situation.
Well, yes, it wasn't the best of situations.
How long would you say you were laying there before the stretcher bearers came?
I was lying there for half an hour before anybody contacted me, and then it was the stretcher bearers who called out to see if I was still alive. I was watching flames coming out of the tank. All the shells were exploding. It was like Guy Fawkes night, but I didn't think that at the time. But subsequently I thought, well, gosh, you couldn't have got more more explosions and fireworks going on than lying there watching this all happening. And of course I had to move once because it was getting too hot for me. I had to move further away because I was beginning to feel the heat from this tank. So I moved a bit further away with difficulty, but it was a necessity for me to get away from the tank and the heat that was being generated.
Were you trying to camouflage yourself at all to hide from the Germans, sir?
No, I wasn't doing anything other than lying there, really, feeling sorry for myself.
What was your game plan, though? Because you didn't know the stretcher bearers were going to come. What would you have done?
I don't know. There was nothing I could do. All I could do was lie there, and what was going to happen, I had no idea at all. But eventually, you know, it did sort itself out.
This is a silly question, but you mentioned the maggots. How did those maggots get there?
Well, I have a suspicion that they were put there by people who did the operation. And I think this is still done even today. I still think that sometimes it seems wise to add these maggots. I'm sure that they were added to my wounds when the amputation was done, and they proliferated, and this was how they came to clean it all up. But as I say, the nurse didn't seem surprised at all, just delighted that they had cleansed the wounds so well.
Could you please tell us, sir, initially, some of the veterans who I've interviewed who have leg or arm injuries, amputations, they talk about phantom pain.
No, I had them to start with, but they very soon went. All I get now is occasionally I will get one of the nerves in either of the stumps, the nerves will start jumping. And that will go on for about 3 or 4 hours, and the stump will jerk along with the pain that comes. It's quite painful, and you go for about perhaps 2 minutes, and then the pain will hit you again, and the stump will perhaps jump a bit. That's unpleasant, and that goes on for about 3 hours sometimes. And there's not much you can do about it. But other than that, I haven't had phantom limb pains as such, but I do get these nerve pains occasionally, but very occasionally, fortunately. But I know when they're coming. I mean, normally speaking, I will suddenly have a bit of a nerve jump, you know, but these go on and for about 3 hours, and they are unpleasant. But that's the only thing that really I can say has affected me from the pain point of view. I never wore shorts because I didn't want people to know that I'd got artificial legs. But now I think they show it as, and not quite rightly, you know, they show it as, you know, sort of it's something to be proud of, I suppose. But from my point of view, it was like the shirt. I didn't want to, you know, sort of publicise the fact that I'd got artificial limbs, really.
You don't like to draw
The more natural I could be, the better I liked it. I didn't want people feeling sorry for me. This was probably it, really. You know, sort of. So, you know, other people have their own worries.
Could you please tell us about, you mentioned you met your wife at the bank.
Yes.
Did you get an opportunity, I guess, when you're recording her, I mean, to take her through the story of what happened? I mean, was she interested in what, you know, your background was?
Yes, I remember that she was staying at my home for a night in separate bedrooms, I might tell you at that time. but I can always remember I did say to her, Barbara, come in and just have a look. And I showed her my stumps. And, you know, that by that stage we knew what was going to happen, really. And I thought it was time she saw what she was taking on, really. And I did call her in and show her my stumps. And, you know, sort of it didn't make any difference. She still married me. But she was quite good in that she didn't pander to me. I mean, if there was something that I'd got to get from upstairs, Barbara wouldn't say, oh, I'll go up. I would go up, you know, sort of, and this was so good. I mean, I have seen instances of people, chaps that, you know, are married and their wives look after them extremely well, but almost do too much for them. And I think it was good for me to have somebody who would say, do a lot for me, but if it was a question of exercise or getting something or doing something, she would let me do it. She wouldn't say, oh no, I'll do that, Roy, you know, sort of. So that was good for me, without any doubt.
You're a wonderful person to talk to, and there's so much people can learn from you.
Yeah, I talk too much though, don't I?
No, not at all.
Yes.
So what life advice do you want to give to future generations, Mr. Hayward?
I think that, you know, treat whatever life does to you, just treat it, you know, sort of as well as you possibly can. Don't give way to despair. Just carry on as well as you possibly can, but don't give way to any despair. That's what I would say anyway.
You mentioned some of your friends, classmates, Boy Scout troops who were killed in the war.
Yeah.
When you look at the society we live in today, you know, it's so divided, people are so angry.
Yes.
It's a very different place.
It is.
What do you want future generations to do to make you feel that the sacrifices you made and that all those young men who were killed, that the sacrifices they made in World War II was worth it? What would you like to see from a societal level?
I would like to see, you know, sort of, I don't know, this is a very difficult one, but I would like to see more countries become accustomed to behaving normally rather than the way they behave at the moment. I mean, I don't like to see all the antagonism that's created throughout the world nowadays. And not only throughout the world, I mean, even in this country, there's antagonism that I don't like at all. You know, sort of people should be able to get on with their lives without any of that at all. But it doesn't seem to be possible nowadays. Unfortunately, the inventions, the online and that sort of thing has enabled people to be nasty to other people without then, without being named for it. They can do it all, undercover, which I hate entirely. Yeah, anonymous criticisms.
What kind of man, Mr. Hayward, do you want people to always think of you as?
I think somebody cheerful. Yes, I think, that's how I would like to be considered, somebody who made the best of things. That's my attitude.
I thank you so much for all your time. You've been so very, very patient, and I am so honored, I know we all are, that you've taken the time to let us into your life and tell us some very tough stories, but also some very inspirational stories.
Good, yes, I'm glad. I've been very pleased to do it.
I appreciate it.
And particularly if, as I say, it benefits Blesma, then from my angle, that's good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
God bless you, sir, and we just thank you for your time.
I was issued with this artificial limb when I first came back from the war. I do remember as a child going into various towns, shopping, etc., and seeing on the pavement injured veterans from the Great War, and they were limbless and they were up on crutches and they were having to beg for money. And that has stayed in my memory for many years. And that is, of course, why eventually Blesma started up, because there were those people that were having no help whatsoever and were on the streets, really, begging and up on crutches.
It's incredible that because of organizations like Blesma, that situation that you witnessed would never happen, obviously, to you.
No.
You would never be put out on the street.
No,
because
no.
of organizations like what they've done.